The morning Cecil Calloway rode into Sweetwater Valley. The sky above the canyon ridges was the color of a bruise healing badly, and every soul in the territory who knew his name had learned to read that particular shade of sky as a warning. He came from the north, following the old cattle trail that wound down through the red rock formations like a river that had forgotten where it was going. His horse, a lean gray roan named Judas, picked its way along the switchbacks with the careful patience of an animal that had survived too many bad decisions made by its rider. Cecil sat easy in the saddle, one hand resting on his thigh, his hat pulled low against the early October sun of 1878. He was 29 years old, tall in a way that seemed to fold itself together when he dismounted, and his face carried the kind of stillness that people either trusted immediately or feared on sight. There was no middle ground with a man like Cecil Calloway. His business in Sweetwater Valley was simple, the way a blade is simple. He had been sent by Harlan Fitch, the territorial land broker who operated out of Santa Fe, to collect a debt that had gone unpaid for 18 months. The debt belonged to one Ada Dalton, widow of Robert Dalton, who had borrowed $1,100 against the deed to her valley ranch to keep her cattle operation alive through the drought of 1876 and had not made a single payment since. Fitch's letter, folded in Cecil's breast pocket alongside his papers of authority, was clear: collect the debt in full or collect the deed. There was no third option. There never was in Fitch's world. Cecil had done this work for 3 years. He was not a violent man in the way that the territory's reputation suggested its collectors tended to be. He did not arrive with hired guns or burn buildings to make his point. He simply arrived, presented his documents with the cool formality of a man who had memorized the territorial statutes, and waited for people to understand that their choices were narrow. It had always been enough. He told himself it would be enough here too. The valley opened below him as he crested the last ridge, and despite himself, despite every professional habit he had built around keeping his feelings somewhere useful, Cecil Calloway pulled Judas to a stop and simply looked. Sweetwater Valley was extraordinary. It was the kind of landscape that felt like it had been painted by someone who loved the West not as it was, but as it ought to be. The valley floor ran roughly 2 miles wide and perhaps 5 miles long, ringed on 3 sides by red sandstone formations that caught the morning light and held it like cupped hands hold water. The valley itself was green in the way that only irrigated land in Arizona territory could be green, a deep, almost shocking green against all that russet stone. A creek ran along the eastern edge, willows trailing their fingers in the slow current. There were cattle in the far pastures, maybe 40 head, Hereford crosses by the look of them, and beyond the pastures a modest ranch house built from adobe and timber, with a covered porch that ran the full length of its front face and a kitchen garden beside it that was still producing in October, which told Cecil something about the woman who tended it. He had read everything Fitch sent him. Ada Dalton, née Cassidy, age 27, married Robert Dalton in 1873. Robert had died of fever in the summer of 1877, leaving Ada alone with the ranch, a small herd, a well that needed work, and a debt that was growing like a weed while everything else in the valley struggled to survive. She had one hired hand, a Mexican man named Tomas Reyes who had worked the Dalton place for 6 years. No children, no family closer than Tucson. Cecil told himself the details were professional. He needed to know his situation before he walked into it. He told himself that, and then he urged Judas down toward the valley floor and kept his eyes on the road and not on the house, because something about seeing that kitchen garden still producing in October had done something unexpected to his chest, and he preferred not to examine what. Ada Dalton heard the horse before she saw the rider. She had been in the kitchen garden since first light, pulling the last of the summer squash and laying them along the porch railing to cure, and she had developed over the past year an acute sensitivity to sounds that did not belong to her ordinary days. The creak of the gate at the end of the property road was one such sound. She straightened, shaded her eyes with her forearm, and watched the rider come down the long approach between the cottonwoods. He was alone, which was something. Fitch's men, in her experience, which consisted of 2 previous visits from a pair of hard-faced men who smelled of whiskey, and carried themselves like they were already bored by the outcome of any conversation they might have, usually came in pairs. One man alone meant either a lesser threat or a greater one, and Ada had learned in the year since Robert died that she was no longer the kind of woman who waited to find out which. She wiped her hands on her apron, went inside, and came back out with her husband's old Winchester rifle, which she had learned to use with reasonable competence over the summer, standing at the fence line and firing at tin cans until Tomas stopped wincing every time she pulled the trigger. She did not raise it. She simply held it, barrel pointed at the ground, standing on the top porch step as the rider came up the approach road and pulled his horse to a stop in the yard. He was not what she expected. Fitch's previous men had looked like what they were, instruments of institutional cruelty dressed in the costume of legitimacy. This man looked like something else. He was lean and dark-haired, with a jaw that needed a shave and eyes the color of creek water in the shade, a kind of gray-green that she found herself cataloging before she reminded herself she was cataloging the wrong things. He sat his horse well. He was dressed plainly, no silver conchos, no ornament, just dark trousers and a canvas coat and a hat that had seen serious weather. He looked at the rifle without changing his expression and then looked at her face. "Mrs. Dalton," he said. His voice was unhurried, low, like water moving over flat stones. "You have the advantage," she said. "You know my name, I don't know yours." "Cecil Calloway," he said. "I represent Harlan Fitch out of Santa Fe. I have papers." "I know what you have," Ada said. "I have been expecting someone like you for about 6 months. I expected you sooner, to tell the truth." "Mr. Fitch is a patient man," Cecil said, and something in his tone suggested that this was not entirely a compliment. He reached slowly into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "May I dismount?" Ada considered him for a moment. "You may," she said. He swung down from the roan with the unhurried economy of someone who had dismounted 10,000 times in weather and conditions that had nothing to do with convenience. He looped the reins over the hitching post and came up to the base of the porch steps, not climbing them, keeping the document extended toward her with a slight formality that she had not expected from a debt collector. She took the document with her free hand and opened it. She had read enough legal language in the past year to navigate it without flinching, though it still made something cold move through her. The document confirmed what she already knew. $1,140 principal plus interest accrued at 8% per annum for 18 months, totaling $1,263 and some cents that she did not have and could not get without selling the cattle she needed to survive the winter. "You understand the terms," Cecil said. It was not a question. "I understand them," Ada said. "What I don't have is the money." There was a silence. The morning wind moved through the cottonwoods. Judah stamped once, shifting his weight. "Then we need to discuss the deed," Cecil said. "No," Ada said. "We do not." He looked at her steadily. She looked back at him just as steadily. She had buried her husband. She had driven cattle by herself when Tomas broke his wrist in June. She had fixed the well casing with her own hands and the help of a diagram she found in a farm almanac from 1872. She was not a woman who frightened easily anymore, though she recognized that she probably should be frightened right now, and some detached part of her found that interesting. "Mrs. Dalton," Cecil said carefully, "I am not here to take something from you. I am here to settle a legal obligation. If there is a way to do that which does not involve the deed, I am willing to hear it." That surprised her. The last 2 men Fitch had sent had not been willing to hear anything. They had simply named the amount, named the consequence, and stood there with their thumbs in their belts like monuments to inflexibility. "Come inside," she said after a moment. "I'll make coffee." He hesitated just briefly. "All right," he said. She went inside and he followed her, leaving his hat on the peg beside the door without being asked, which told her something. The kitchen was clean and spare, with a rough pine table and 4 chairs and a cast iron stove that was one of the better things Robert had spent money on. Ada put the rifle beside the door, within reach but not in her hands, and set water to boil. Cecil Calloway sat down at the table without invitation, which was the right thing to do, and looked around the kitchen with the eyes of a man cataloging rather than judging. "How long have you been working this land?" he asked. "Since 1873, she said. 5 years. Robert's family had the original claim. I came with him from Missouri." "Long way," Cecil said. "It was," she agreed. She brought 2 tin cups of coffee to the table and sat across from him. He wrapped his hands around the cup, and she noticed his hands, which were the hands of someone who worked, calloused across the palm and at the base of the fingers, not a desk man's hands despite the papers he carried. "Here is what I can offer," Ada said, because she had been composing this speech in her head for 6 months. "I have 43 head of cattle. In the spring, after calving, I will have closer to 60. If I sell 20 head in Tucson before winter at current market price, I can pay Fitch $800. The rest I can pay in installments through the following year, with the cattle as security." Cecil was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slightly on the table. "Fitch won't accept installments," he said. "Will Fitch accept $800 now and the rest by July of next year?" Ada said. "I don't know," Cecil said honestly. "I can write to him. And in the meantime—" "In the meantime, nothing changes," Cecil said. He looked at her directly, and she saw something in his eyes that was more complicated than the professional neutrality he had been wearing since he rode in. "I have no intention of turning a woman off her land in October in Arizona territory, whatever my employer's instructions." Ada looked at him. "That is either very kind of you or it is a strategy to lower my guard," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, a slight shift at one corner of his mouth. "I suppose you will have to decide which," he said. She decided in that moment that she would extend him the provisional trust that one extended to a stranger in the wild country because you simply had no other currency to work with. Not full trust. Not yet, but she would not point the rifle at him either. "There is a spare room," she said, "if you need to stay while you write to Fitch and wait for the reply." He looked at her with that Creekwater gaze. "That is generous," he said. "It is practical," Ada said. "Tucson is 4 hours south. The next town north is 6 hours. A man alone in this territory ought to have a roof over him at night, and if you are here, at least I know what you are doing." This time he did smile, a full one, brief and genuine, and it transformed his face in a way she filed away without meaning to. "I appreciate the honesty," he said. "It is all I have left to be generous with," Ada said, and turned back to the stove, and did not let him see that her hands were not entirely steady. Tomas Reyes was not pleased about any of it. He was a compact, serious man of 42, who had developed a fierce protective attachment to the Dalton ranch over the years, and particularly to Ada since Robert's death. He received the news of Cecil's extended stay with the expression of a man who had been handed a scorpion and told to hold it gently. "He works for Fitch," Tomas said, when Ada told him that evening while they were turning the cattle into the night pasture. "He does," Ada said. "Fitch wants this land." "Fitch wants the money," Ada said. "He only wants the land if he can't get the money." "And you trust this man Calloway to say true about writing to Fitch?" "I trust him enough to let him sleep in the spare room and not enough to sleep soundly myself," Ada said. "That is the right amount of trust for this particular situation." Tomas made a sound that was not agreement, but was not argument either. He had learned over the years that Ada Dalton made decisions with a combination of clear thinking and gut instinct that had a better track record than most. "I will keep the spare horse saddled," he said. "In case." "In case what?" Ada said. Tomas looked at her steadily. "In case things change," he said. And that was all. Cecil wrote his letter to Fitch that first evening, sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight while Ada read from a worn copy of a farming almanac and pretended to be absorbed in it. He wrote carefully, professionally, laying out Ada's counter-proposal with the precision of a man who was trying to thread a needle in poor light. He explained that the operation was viable, that the herd was in reasonable condition, that the land itself was worth considerably more than the debt, and that Fitch's investment was fully secured against it. He did not mention that Ada had offered him coffee, or that her kitchen smelled of herbs drying over the stove, or that her hair, which was dark and thick, and pinned up in the inexact way of a woman who has more urgent things to attend to, had a strand that kept escaping near her left ear, and she kept tucking it back without thinking about it. He sealed the letter and said he would ride to the trading post at Redrock Crossing in the morning, which was a day's ride, to get it into the mail line headed south. "I can ride with you," Ada said. "I need to send a letter of my own to the cattle broker in Tucson. I want to arrange the sale." "You are willing to sell the 20 head now," Cecil said. "I was always going to have to sell something," Ada said quietly. "Better to choose it myself than have it taken from me." He looked at her for a long moment across the lamplight, and something passed between them that neither of them named or acknowledged. "Yes," he said, "I suppose that is so." They rode out together the next morning at first light. The valley was extraordinarily beautiful in the early hours, the creek catching the light, the sandstone walls turning orange and then gold as the sun climbed. Cecil rode Judas and Ada rode her own horse, a sturdy dark bay mare named Pepper that she handled with a casual confidence that was clearly the product of years of daily use rather than any particular instruction. They rode mostly in silence for the first hour, the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable but is still being negotiated. "Where are you from originally?" Ada asked eventually. "Kentucky," Cecil said. "A long time ago. What brought you west?" He was quiet for a moment, which she was beginning to understand was not evasiveness, but simply the way he moved through language, the same way he moved through country, with care. "The war took most of what was there," he said. "Afterward, there did not seem to be much reason to stay in a place that was mostly made of what used to be there." Ada nodded. She understood that kind of geography, the landscape of absence. "Missouri was the same," she said. "Robert's family lost everything. Coming west was about starting with nothing somewhere that did not remind them of it at every turn." "Did it help?" Cecil asked. "The land helped," Ada said, looking out over the red rock formations as they passed. "This specific land. There is something about this valley that feels like it was waiting to be found by someone who needed it. I know that sounds foolish." "It doesn't," Cecil said simply. By midday they were at Redrock Crossing, a cluster of adobe buildings around a trading post run by a man named Samuel Crow, who was broad and weathered, and looked at Cecil with the particular assessment of a man who had seen all varieties of Western archetype come through his door, and was cataloging which one this was. They posted their letters, and Cecil bought grain for the horses, and Ada bought a small sack of salt and 2 yards of muslin that she needed for the kitchen. They ate lunch on the trading post porch, dried beef and cornbread that Samuel's wife provided with the automatic hospitality of a woman who fed travelers as a matter of course, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with debts or deeds. Cecil told her about a horse race he had witnessed in Albuquerque the previous spring that had somehow involved a mule, a broken fence, and the mayor's best hat. Ada laughed at the image of it, a genuine laugh that she had not heard herself produce in what felt like a very long time. It surprised her. It surprised him too. She could see it in the way he looked at her, not with calculation but with something that was almost wonder. "You have a good laugh," he said before he seemed to have fully decided to say it. The moment stretched between them like a piece of new cloth, both of them handling it carefully so as not to stress it. "I have not had much occasion for it recently," she said. "No," he said, "I imagine not." They rode home in the afternoon light, with the conversation moving more easily now, the ice of professional distance beginning to thin from something to nothing. He told her about the territory, which he had been traveling for 3 years and knew with the particular intimacy of someone who has covered ground rather than simply looked at maps. He told her about the Apache situation, which was still unresolved and dangerous in some parts of the territory, and how the routes had changed in the past 2 years because of it. He told her about a valley he had seen once north of the Gila River that had wild horses in it, 40 or 50 of them running free, and how he had sat on a ridge for an hour just watching. She told him about building the kitchen garden, how the first year nothing grew because she had not fully understood the soil and the water table, how the second year she had been so determined that she had read everything she could find about irrigation and desert soils, and had written to an agricultural college in the East, and received a pamphlet that changed how she understood the land. How the third year the garden had been so productive that she had more squash than she could eat in a decade, and had given most of it away to the families at the mining camp 6 miles south. "You gave food to the miners," Cecil said. "Their families," Ada said. "There were children there who were hungry." "What was I going to do, let them be hungry while my squash sat rotting?" Cecil looked at her sidelong and she could not quite read his expression. It was something that operated below the surface of the professional neutrality, something deeper and more complicated. "Most people would not have," he said. "Most people have not been hungry," Ada said. "I have. In the first year here, after a crop failure, I know what it is and I do not wish it on children." The sun was low behind the western ridge by the time they came back down through the cottonwoods to the ranch yard. Tomas was sitting on the porch with a coffee cup and the expression of a man who had been waiting to count noses and verify no disasters had occurred. He counted them, verified, and went back inside without comment. That evening, Ada made a proper supper, which she told herself was simply because she had the ingredients and the energy, and not at all because there was someone at her table who was not Tomas, and who had made her laugh on the porch of a trading post, and told her about wild horses in the Gila Valley, with a kind of quiet reverence that she found herself thinking about while she stirred the pot. She made a beef stew with the last of the root vegetables from the garden and cornbread from the Dutch oven, and Cecil ate with the focused appreciation of a man who has been living on trail food for an extended period and had temporarily forgotten what a proper meal tasted like. He told her it was the best meal he had eaten in at least a year, possibly longer. "That is a sad reflection on your life," Ada said. "It is an honest one," Cecil said, and he was looking at her with that particular gray-green gaze, and there was nothing professional about it at all, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything about it. After supper, Cecil offered to help with the dishes, which Ada declined, and then he went out to the porch and she could hear him through the kitchen window, talking quietly to Judas at the hitching post, and something about the sound of a man talking to his horse in the dark, in the same low, unhurried voice he used for everything, was more intimate than anything she knew how to account for. She washed the dishes and listened and told herself nothing. The reply from Fitch came in 11 days. 11 days in which the rhythms of the ranch simply incorporated Cecil Calloway, the way a river incorporates a new tributary, without drama, with a certain inevitability. He was useful in ways that did not feel calculated. He helped Tomas repair the fence line on the north pasture, working with the same economic efficiency he brought to everything, no wasted motion, no complaining about blisters. He spent an afternoon clearing debris from the irrigation channel that diverted water from the creek to the garden, a job that was muddy and unpleasant, and that he did without being asked, because he had noticed it needed doing when they rode past it on their way to Redrock Crossing. Tomas's assessment of him shifted by degrees from deep suspicion to cautious respect. Ada watched this with a private satisfaction. Tomas was not an easy man to earn respect from, and the fact that Cecil had done it not through any deliberate campaign, but simply through showing up and working told her something about the nature of the man. What she was less sure about was the nature of her own response to that man. She caught herself doing things that she recognized as significant, putting on the slightly better dress when she knew they would be in the same space. Noticing the way he moved, that contained, unhurried economy of motion that her husband Robert had not had, Robert being a generous and kind man who had nevertheless moved through the world with a kind of forward momentum and noise that was the opposite of stillness. She noticed the way Cecil listened, not the polite half-listening of someone waiting to speak, but actual listening, the kind that processed everything and gave it weight. She noticed that he never presumed. He was there every morning at the table when she made coffee, and it had become a routine without discussion, the two of them sitting across from each other in the early quiet before Tomas came in, and the day's work began, talking or not talking equally comfortably. She told him things about the valley, its history, its moods. He told her things about the territory, careful pieces of his experience, offered not as performance but as genuine exchange. On the sixth day, sitting on the porch after supper while the October night came down cold and clear, he told her about his time working for Fitch, not with pride, but not with apology either. With the honesty of someone who has examined a thing and is presenting his findings. I took this work because it paid well and because I told myself it was legal and therefore legitimate, he said. I have been reconsidering the second part of that. Ada pulled her shawl tighter. When did you start reconsidering it? He looked at the stars. Before I came here, he said, but coming here has been something of an education. I am glad to be of educational value, Ada said dryly. He turned his head and looked at her, and this time he held the look for a moment longer than he had been allowing himself to, and she held it back. The lamplight from the kitchen window fell across his face, and the night around them was very quiet, just the creek and the cattle settling and the fire popping inside. Ada, he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the formal Mrs. Dalton in front of it. She felt it like a change in weather. Cecil, she said. And then Tomas came out to say the north fence gate was loose again, and the moment broke apart, gently, the way things break apart when they are interrupted rather than ended, and they both looked away and the conversation became other things. But her name in his mouth stayed with her. It stayed with her through washing up and through checking the stove and through lying in her bed listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, which she knew as intimately as she knew her own heartbeat, and which now included the slight creak of the spare room floorboard that she had not noticed was a sound until there was someone in that room to make it. She was not a foolish woman. She understood the situation with perfect clarity. This man had come here to take her land. He worked for the person who most threatened her livelihood and her future. The fact that he was being decent about it did not change the fundamental structure of his presence here, and she was experienced enough with the world to know that decent men could still carry out indecent instructions if the instructions came with a paycheck attached. She knew all of this. She also knew that she had not been spoken to in 11 days with as much genuine attention and respect as Cecil Calloway brought to every single exchange they had, and that this said something devastating about the loneliness of the previous year. She told herself she was lonely. She told herself that was all it was. The telling was not entirely convincing. The reply from Fitch arrived on the morning of the 12th day, delivered by a rider from Reed Rock Crossing who accepted 2 bits for the service and rode back north without ceremony. Cecil read it at the kitchen table while Ada stood at the stove and Tomas stood in the doorway. His expression, which was usually carefully composed, went through several things that Ada watched without speaking. Then he put the letter down on the table and looked at her. Fitch has declined the installment proposal, he said. Ada's stomach dropped. She had been preparing herself for this, but preparation and the thing itself were different countries. He wants full payment, Cecil continued, or the deed. He says he has a buyer for the valley already identified and that the delay has cost him the carrying charges and he is no longer willing to be flexible. He paused. He has given a deadline, November the 1st, 3 weeks. Tomas made a sound and left the doorway abruptly. Ada heard the porch door close. She turned back to the stove and stirred something that did not need stirring. Then she put the spoon down and turned around. Then I will sell the cattle, she said. All 43 head. That should cover most of it. The rest I will have to figure out. Ada, Cecil said. And there was something in his voice that was not professional at all, that was personal and troubled, and that she could not look it directly right now because she was using all of her available composure to stay upright and clear-headed. Selling all your cattle leaves you with a ranch and no operation. Selling the deed leaves me with no ranch at all, Ada said flatly. I know which of those I prefer. Let me write to him again, Cecil said. You said he was not going to be flexible. I said he was not going to be flexible. Those are not the same thing. He stood up, pushing back from the table. Fitch has a buyer already identified, which means someone else has been circling this land while he was supposedly waiting on your payments. That is useful information. It tells me this was never really about the money. Ada looked at him. What do you mean? Cecil pulled up a chair and sat down again and leaned forward with his forearms on the table. And this was a different Cecil than the one who had ridden in 12 days ago. This was a man who had walked the land and fixed fences and eaten supper at her table, and was now sitting across from her with something fierce and quiet in his gray-green eyes that she was fairly sure Harlan Fitch had not factored into his calculations. I mean that Fitch likely sold your debt to someone who wants this valley. The interest and the hard deadline and the no installments, that is not the behavior of a creditor who wants to be paid. That is the behavior of a creditor who wants to take something. And whoever wants this valley has probably been promised it. Who would want Sweetwater Valley badly enough to orchestrate this? Ada said. A man named Elias Borden, Cecil said, and he said it with the particular flatness of someone naming a thing they have been rolling over in their mind for some time. He is a land consolidator who has been buying up valley ranches in this territory for 2 years. I have worked his edges without fully understanding what the whole picture was. He operates through brokers like Fitch. He buys debt from desperate ranchers and hard-luck operations and converts it to land. He now holds something like 14,000 acres between here and the Gila River. The silence stretched. And no one has stopped him, Ada said. With what legal tool? Cecil said. He buys legitimate debt. He forecloses through legitimate process. There is no law that says a man cannot accumulate land if every individual transaction is legal. The law and justice are not always acquaintances, Ada said. No, Cecil agreed. They are not. He was looking at her with that intensity she had been keeping in her peripheral vision for 12 days. She looked back at him fully, and the kitchen was very quiet, and she thought of all the things she should be feeling right now. The fear about the debt and the deadline and the cattle sale. And what she found when she looked was that all of those real and serious things were sharing the room with something else. Something that had been building over 12 days of coffee in the early morning, and work in the afternoon sun and conversation on the porch under October stars. Something she had no professional armor against at all. What are you going to do? She asked, and the question was about more than the debt, and both of them understood that. I am going to find out exactly who Borden's representative is in this situation, Cecil said, and I am going to write a letter that is not to Fitch. Who will you write to? A lawyer I know in Tucson, Cecil said. Thomas Hartwell. He has been working on land consolidation cases for 2 years. If there is a pattern of this kind of fraud documented across enough individual cases, there is a territorial injunction available. It has been used once before against a railroad land acquisition. It can be used against a private buyer. Ada stared at him. You would do this, she said. Even though it means you are working against your employer. He looked at her steadily. I have not been working for my employer in the spirit in which he intended for at least a week now, he said, and I would rather know that clearly than pretend otherwise. Something broke open in her chest. She did not mean for it to, but there it was. Cecil, she said carefully, I need you to know something. I am grateful for what you are doing. I want to be clear that I understand why you are doing it, and that I do not want you to do it if you are doing it for reasons that are not entirely sound. He looked at her for a long moment. I am doing it because it is the right thing to do, he said. And I am doing it because this valley and this ranch deserve to exist under the ownership of the person who built it and tends it and knows where every fence post needs checking." He paused. "And I am doing it because I have been sitting at your table for 12 days and riding over your land, and I have the distinct and inconvenient feeling that I would like to keep doing that, and I cannot keep doing it if Borden has it." The words sat between them, honest and precise and frightening in the way that honest and precise things can be. "That last reason," Ada said slowly, "is the one that is going to require some additional conversation." "Yes," Cecil said, "I expect it is." He stood up. "But first, the letter to Hartwell." He rode to Redrock Crossing that afternoon and rode back the next morning, having spent the night there to rest the horse, and in his absence Ada found herself marking the hours by the light and not being entirely comfortable with the fact that she was doing so. Tomas noticed. He said nothing directly because that was not his way, but he came to find her in the kitchen garden in the late afternoon where she was pulling the last of the carrots, and he crouched down beside her and worked alongside her in silence for a while, and then he said without preamble, "He is a good man, I think." Ada looked at him. "You have changed your opinion," she said. "I've gathered more information," Tomas said. "A man who works a fence line without complaint and is not condescending about another man's work, that is a man worth looking at more carefully." "He works for Fitch," Ada said. "He worked for Fitch," Tomas said. "I think that may be past tense now." He stood up and dusted his knees. "I'm not telling you what to feel or what to do. I am saying that I was watching, and what I see is a man who rode in here for one purpose and found a better one." He looked at her with the directness of a man who has known her for 6 years and has no patience for pretense. "And I am saying that you have not laughed like you laughed the other evening in 3 years, maybe 4. I was counting." Ada put a carrot in the basket. "Tomas," she said. "I'm going to check the north pasture," he said, and walked away, and she stayed crouched among the carrot tops for a long moment and let herself feel what she had been filing away. Cecil came back the following morning with the particular energy of a man who has been thinking very hard about something for a significant number of hours. He came in through the kitchen door while Ada was making coffee and dropped his hat on the peg and sat down without ceremony and began explaining what Hartwell had told him. Thomas Hartwell was, it turned out, well aware of Elias Borden. He had been building a case for 14 months, and he had identified a pattern of what he believed was deliberate debt manipulation, the purchase of small ranch debts at inflated interest rates from secondary lenders with the specific intent to foreclose rather than be repaid. He had 7 cases documented. He needed 8 to bring a pattern claim under territorial law. The Dalton debt was, potentially, the 8th. "If we can document that Borden purchased your debt from a secondary lender rather than directly from the original borrower," Cecil said, "and if we can show that the terms were set to make repayment structurally impossible, Hartwell believes he can make a territorial fraud case and seek an injunction against all of Borden's outstanding foreclosure actions, including this one." Ada sat down across from him. "Can we document that?" "We need to trace the debt from the original lender through to Fitch and then to Borden," Cecil said. "The original loan was through the First Territorial Bank of Santa Fe, which is a real bank. Fitch is an intermediary. If Borden bought the debt from Fitch, there will be a paper trail because everything Borden does is careful and legal on the surface. He is not a man who operates outside the law. He operates just inside it, which means there are documents. And you can get those documents," Ada said. Cecil looked at her with a slight, careful expression. "I have access to Fitch's business correspondence in the normal course of my employment," he said. "And I have a letter from Fitch here in my possession that already identifies Borden as the interested buyer. Combined with what Hartwell already has, that may be enough." "You would use your access to Fitch's correspondence against him," Ada said. "His correspondence to me, discussing the disposal of a specific debt that is my professional responsibility to collect," Cecil said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "I'm aware this ends my employment with Fitch. I'm aware it may make working as a debt collector in this territory impossible afterward, I have thought about this very carefully. And, Ada said, he looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and I have decided that there are worse things than the end of an employment that I was already reconsidering. Ada was quiet for a long time. The coffee cooled slightly in their cups. Outside, the morning light was doing extraordinary things to the sandstone walls of the valley, turning them from red to gold to something that had no name in any language she knew, and she was suddenly very aware that she had spent a year in this valley alone, and that this morning she was not alone, and that this felt like exactly the natural state of things, and that realizing this was both terrifying and simple. "Cecil," she said, "I need to say something that may change the way you are thinking about this." "All right," he said quietly. "I do not want you to do this only for me," she said. "I mean, I do not want the weight of your choices to be mine to carry. You said yourself there are 7 other ranches in this pattern. If you do this, do it for all of them. Do it because it is right. Not because you are sitting in my kitchen and I make decent coffee and you have decided you would like to keep sitting here." He was looking at her with something that she could only call reverence, which was not a word she had ever expected to be relevant to her own life. "I am doing it for all of them," he said. "And I am not going to pretend that sitting in your kitchen has nothing to do with it, but you are right that it cannot be the whole of it." He paused. "It is perhaps the part that gave me the clarity to see clearly what I had been choosing not to see about this work." She reached across the table, not touching him, just a slight extension of her hand, and then pulled it back. "Then let us write to Hartwell," she said. They did together, and the collaboration was something she filed away alongside everything else. The way he caught errors in her legal language, the way she caught implications in the factual record that he had not thought to emphasize, the way the letter they produced together was better than either of them would have produced alone. Hartwell came to Sweetwater Valley himself, which they had not expected. He arrived 3 days later on a rented horse, a small and precise man of 50 with spectacles and the particular intensity of a man who has been fighting a long fight and has just been given something he needed badly. He spent an entire day at the kitchen table with all the documents and his own files and Cecil's Fitch correspondence, and by the end of it he was satisfied. "I can file the injunction petition by the end of the week," he said. "The territorial judge in Tucson owes me a hearing, and I believe I have enough for an emergency stay of all Borden-related foreclosures pending the fraud investigation." "How long will the investigation take?" Ada asked. 6 months, perhaps a year," Hartwell said, "but the stay will protect your deed in the interim. Once the fraud case is established, the original debt may be voided entirely as part of the judgment." He looked at her over his spectacles. "You may not owe this money at all, Mrs. Dalton, if the court agrees that the loan was structured as a predatory instrument." Ada stared at him. "Void the debt," she said. "If Borden directed Fitch to acquire your original bank debt and adjust its terms upward specifically to ensure default, the original contract may be found to have been corrupted by fraud in its subsequent administration," Hartwell said, with the brisk precision of a man reciting statute. "The court has discretion to void such contracts." Cecil was watching her from across the table. He was doing his best to maintain his composed expression and not entirely succeeding. She stood up from the table and went to the kitchen window and looked out at the valley, her valley, the creek running silver in the afternoon light, the cattle in the far pasture, the kitchen garden with its dried stalks and curring squash along the porch rail. She had built this. She had maintained this through drought and fever and grief and hard winter and isolation, and the particular brutality of being alone in the wild country, without anyone to face the hard days with. And now a small, precise man with spectacles was telling her it might be kept. She heard Cecil's chair push back. She heard him come to stand behind her, not close, not touching, but there, and she was aware of him the way she had become aware of the sounds of the ranch at night, as something that belonged in the inventory of this place. "You are not going to cry," she told herself firmly. "I am going to step outside," she said aloud, to both of them, and she did. and she stood on the porch in the October air and breathed and let herself feel the enormity of it without anyone watching. After a moment she heard the porch door open and close, and she knew by the footstep that it was Cecil and not Hartwell. He came to stand beside her, looking out at the valley the way she was looking at it. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. "Then do not try," he said. "You gave me the clarity to do the thing. The thanks belong to the clarity." She looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the valley, and his profile in the afternoon light was something she was going to carry in her memory for a very long time, regardless of how this turned out or did not. "What happens to you now?" she asked. "You have burned your bridges with Fitch. You have lost your employment." "I have been thinking about that," he said. "Have you arrived at anything?" He turned to look at her, and the look was direct and quiet and held more than she was ready to process all at once. "I have arrived at a question that I do not feel entirely at liberty to ask yet," he said. "There are some things that need to resolve first. Hartwell's petition needs to succeed. Your deed needs to be secured. I do not want to ask you things while you are in an uncertain position, because I cannot be sure that any answer you gave me would be entirely free." Ada looked at him for a long moment, and then she turned back to the valley. "That is very principled," she said. "It is," Cecil agreed. "It is also," she said carefully, "going to require that I wait a somewhat extended period of time for a question I may have opinions about already." A beat of silence. "Yes," Cecil said, and she could hear the suppressed smile in his voice. "I expect it is." Hartwell filed his petition in Tucson 4 days before Fitch's November 1st deadline. The territorial judge granted an emergency stay of all Borden foreclosure actions within 48 hours, which was faster than Hartwell had expected, and which he attributed. In a letter that arrived at the ranch one morning, while Ada was in the garden and Cecil was helping Tomas reinforce the west fence line, to the fact that Borden had badly overplayed his hand in 2 other cases, and the judge had been waiting for exactly this kind of consolidated challenge. Ada read the letter at the kitchen table and then went to the west fence line and told Cecil and Tomas, and then stood in the field and looked at the sky for a long time. Tomas, who was a man of considerable emotional economy, clapped Cecil once on the shoulder and went back to setting fence posts. Cecil watched Ada looking at the sky and then crossed the field to her and stood beside her, and she turned and looked at him, and whatever professional distance or cautious uncertainty had been operating between them for the past 3 weeks was simply no longer present in any meaningful way. "It is going to hold," he said. "It is going to hold," she said. She reached out and took his hand. It was the first time they had touched in any way, and it was not a small thing for either of them. His hand closed around hers, and they stood in the field under the October sky, and the valley was spread around them, extraordinary and green and red and gold, and Ada Dalton felt for the first time in a year that the ground under her feet was solid in every sense that mattered. "Cecil," she said. "Ada," he said. "Ask me the question," she said. He looked at her, and his gray-green eyes were full of something she recognized as courage, the particular courage of a man who is not a coward in any physical sense, but is afraid of a different kind of vulnerability entirely. "I came here to take something from you," he said. "That is the truth of it, and I am not going to pretty it up. I came here with papers and intent, and I had done this enough times that I had stopped thinking very hard about what it meant. And then I rode down into this valley, and you were standing on your porch with a rifle and the most direct eyes I have ever looked into, and in the course of 3 weeks you have entirely rearranged the furniture of who I am." He paused. "I would like very much to stay in this valley, if you will permit it. I would like to work this land with you, if you will permit it. And I would like, if the day comes when you are ready and it seems right to you, for that to be a permanent arrangement." Ada was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the field grass. The creek ran over its stones with the sound it had always made, the sound she knew better than almost any other sound in the world. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I am not a simple prospect. I am a widow with a debt that may or may not be voided by a territorial court, a herd of 43 cattle, a difficult kitchen garden, a hired hand who will require you to pass continuing scrutiny, and a very strong opinion about most things. I have noticed all of those things, Cecil said, and I find myself in favor of every one of them. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, not the professional cataloging she had done on the first day, but something else entirely, something that was taking inventory not of threat but of possibility. "Then yes," she said, "you may stay." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a single, brief, deliberate kiss to her knuckles, and it was more intimate than anything she had experienced in longer than she could easily calculate, and she let herself feel it fully, standing in her field in October in 1878, with the valley walls turning gold around them, and the cattle moving slow in the far pasture, and Tomas setting fence posts with the practiced rhythm of a man who is deliberately not looking in this direction. The winter came early and cold to Sweetwater Valley, the first hard frost arriving in mid-November, which was unusual for Arizona territory but not unheard of at that elevation. Cecil stayed, and his staying was not awkward or provisional but settled, as though the valley had simply incorporated him the way it had incorporated the creek and the cottonwoods and the red rock formations. He was good at work, not just willing, which she had known from the first days, but good, with the particular competence of a man who has been self-reliant for a long time and has developed practical skills across a wide range of needs. He reinforced the barn roof before the freeze and built a proper drying rack for the kitchen herbs that was better than the improvised one Ada had been using for 3 years. He and Tomas developed a working rhythm that, Ada thought, was probably the male version of the quiet trust she had been building with Cecil herself, constructed mostly in silence and demonstrated through parallel action. There was a gradual courtship happening, slow and genuine, conducted in the daily fabric of ranch life. The morning coffee that had become a ritual now had a different texture to it, less careful, more itself. They talked about everything. They disagreed, sometimes sharply, about practical matters, about timing the cattle sales, about which of the calves to keep for the coming herd, about the best route for the spring drive to Tucson, and the disagreements were conducted with the respect and directness of two people who have decided to take each other seriously. He kissed her for the first time on a December evening, when the first hard snow of the season came down over the valley walls and turned everything white and silent in an hour. They had been standing on the porch watching it come, both wrapped in their coats, and the valley in the snow was so extraordinary, so completely itself in a way that was different from every other version of it she had seen, that she made a sound that was something between a laugh and a gasp, and he looked at her face instead of the snow, and then simply and deliberately turned toward her and kissed her. And she kissed him back with the full intention and attention of a woman who has thought carefully about this particular thing and arrived at a clear position. It was not a tentative kiss. It was a proper kiss, warm and unhurried in the cold air, and when they broke apart the snow was still coming down and the valley was still white and astonishing, and she leaned her forehead briefly against his jaw before straightening. "There," she said. "Yes," he said. "There." Tomas, inside the kitchen, made coffee with the careful attention of a man who is giving two people on the porch all the privacy they require. The territorial court's investigation of Elias Borden and Harlan Fitch proceeded through the winter. Hartwell wrote periodically with updates, each one more favorable than the last. Borden had attempted to settle with 3 of the 7 other ranchers, which Hartwell said was evidence of consciousness of guilt, and which the court was treating accordingly. Fitch had provided testimony that, while carefully self-serving, inadvertently documented the arrangement between himself and Borden in ways that Hartwell found invaluable. In February of 1879, the territorial court issued its ruling. It was 60 pages long, and Ada read all of it, sitting at the kitchen table with Cecil on one side and Hartwell's covering letter on the other. The ruling found a systematic pattern of predatory debt acquisition and fraudulent foreclosure intent across 8 individual ranching operations, including the Dalton property. It voided all 8 debts entirely, ordered Borden to compensate the ranchers for costs and distress, and barred him and Fitch from operating as land brokers in the Arizona Territory for 15 years. The Dalton debt was gone. The deed to Sweetwater Valley was clear. Ada read to the end of the ruling and put it down on the table and looked at Cecil and said, "It is ours," and then corrected herself. "It is mine," she said. "It is fully mine." "Yes," Cecil said, "it is." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know that what I said, that this land is mine, I said that as a statement of the court's finding and not as a statement about the future." He looked back at her with complete steadiness. "I understand that," he said. "Good," she said, "because the future is a separate conversation." She picked up the ruling again and pretended to read it, but she was smiling and he saw it. He proposed to her in March, when the first green came back to the valley floor, and the cattle were heavy with calves, and the creek was running high with snowmelt from the high country. He did not make it a performance. He came to find her in the kitchen garden, where she was turning the soil for the new season's planting, and he said her name and she straightened and looked at him, and he said, with his characteristic direct economy, "I would like to marry you, Ada, if you will have me. I believe we would be very good at it." She considered him for a long moment, the way she had considered him that first day on the porch, but this time what she was measuring was not threat but sufficiency, and what she found was that the measurement came back full. "I believe we would," she said. "Yes." They were married in April of 1879 in Tucson, in a small ceremony with Tomas and Hartwell as witnesses, and a judge who had known Robert Dalton and who shook Cecil's hand with the firm measuring grip of a man satisfying himself that the right choice had been made and concluded that it had. They came back to Sweetwater Valley in the late afternoon, and the light was the extraordinary golden red of late April in the canyon country, and Ada stood in the yard of her ranch as Cecil unsaddled the horses and thought about all the ways the valley had absorbed change, drought and death and threat and winter, and had remained essentially itself, extraordinary and green and red and present. She thought about the fact that she had stood on this porch a year ago with a rifle and a debt, and a loneliness so absolute it had become part of the landscape, and that the man who had ridden down through her cottonwoods into her yard had come to take something from her and had ended by giving her something she had not known she was missing. She thought that the world was a complicated and sometimes brutal place, and that sometimes, in the wild spaces between its brutalities, something extraordinary happened, and you had to be clear-sighted enough to see it and brave enough to let it matter. Cecil came up onto the porch and stood beside her. "Welcome home," she said, and meant it in every possible direction. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked out at the valley together, the creek, the cattle, the sandstone walls going red gold in the last light, and it was as complete as anything she could imagine. The summer of 1879 was the best growing season the valley had seen in 5 years. Ada's kitchen garden produced in abundance, and she expanded it, adding 2 new beds along the south wall of the barn and planting tomatoes in a row that stretched the length of the fence line. The cattle herd grew through calving season from 43 to 61 head, which was exactly the threshold Cecil had identified as the point at which the operation could sustain itself through a bad year with reserve. They hired a second hand, a young man named Eli Cross from the mining camp to the south, whose family Ada had fed squash to during the hard year of 1877, and who was 18 and hardworking and grateful for the employment in the straightforward way of someone who has not yet learned to complicate gratitude. Tomas took Eli's education as a ranch hand very seriously, and conducted it with the solemn rigor of a man passing on a tradition, which it was. Ada watched Tomas teaching Eli the particular management of Sweetwater Valley's water system, the irrigation channels and the well and the way the creek ran different in the dry season versus the wet, and felt a complicated warmth for it, the transmission of knowledge, the continuity of care. Cecil had written, in the spring, to Thomas Hartwell about the possibility of assisting with other territorial land rights cases, not as a debt collector, but as something different, an investigator who understood the mechanics of debt consolidation from the inside and could help identify and document patterns before they became full predatory schemes. Hartwell had been enthusiastic. It was not regular work, and the pay was modest, but it was work that Cecil came home from with a straightness in his posture that the debt collection work had never produced. Ada had watched him compose the letter to Hartwell and had said nothing about it, but she thought about it often, about the fact that his presence in her valley had changed not just her landscape but his own, had given him a direction that was oriented towards something rather than simply executing on something else's behalf. She thought about responsibility and freedom, and how those things interacted, and she thought about the injustice of systems that preyed on people in hard years, the Bordens and the Fitches of the world who understood that the law could be used as a weapon if you were careful and patient and willing to work just inside its edges. She talked about this with Cecil in the long evenings, the kitchen quiet and warm, the lamp between them, and she found in those conversations the thing she had missed most profoundly in the year of her solitude, not just company or comfort, but genuine intellectual engagement with someone who thought carefully and honestly and was willing to change his mind. In November of 1879, a year almost exactly to the day after Cecil had ridden into Sweetwater Valley with Harlan Fitch's papers in his coat, Ada told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, over coffee, which was where they told each other most of the things that mattered. He was quiet for a moment and she watched his face, and what she saw move across it was a sequence of things: surprise, and then something very deep and still, and then something that was simply joy, plain and complete. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and did not say anything for a moment, which was entirely consistent with who he was. "Well," he said finally. "That is something." "It is," Ada agreed. "Are you well?" he asked immediately, which was the right question. "I am well," she said. "I have been tired, but well." He stood up and came around the table and crouched beside her chair, which was not a thing she had ever seen him do before, and took both her hands in his and looked at her with everything he had. "Ada Calloway," he said. She smiled. She had been Ada Calloway for 7 months, and it still had the quality of something new and right, like a well-fitted door that sits in its frame properly. "Cecil Calloway," she said. "We are going to be excellent at this," he said. "We are," she agreed. "Though I will note that I have read considerably more about it than you have, and I expect my opinions on the subject to be given appropriate weight." He laughed, which was a sound she had cultivated and collected all year with the same care she gave to the kitchen garden. "Of course they will," he said. Their son was born in the high summer of 1880, on a July morning when the valley was at its most extraordinary, deep green and blazing sky, and the creek running clear over the smooth stones. Ada labored through the night with the attendance of a midwife from the settlement at Reed Rock Crossing, a capable woman named Martha Bird, who had delivered half the children in the Valley Territory, and who approached the process with a brisk pragmatism that Ada found immensely reassuring. Cecil spent the night on the porch, which was where he had been instructed to be, in the proximity that was most useful, and Tomas kept him company through the dark hours, both of them sitting under the stars with coffee cups that got refilled several times, saying very little, which was the right thing. When Martha Bird came to the porch door in the early morning and said that all was well and that he had a son, Cecil stood up from the porch steps, and for a moment he was very still, and then he walked inside. Ada was in the bed in the back room with the baby wrapped and settled beside her, and she was tired in a way that was completely clean, not the tired of the hard year, but the tired of something accomplished. She looked up when Cecil came in and she saw his face and she thought she had not seen him undone before, not in a year of watching him closely. He was undone now, and she loved him for it. He sat beside her carefully, the way one sits beside things that are precious, and looked at the baby with the full catalog of his attention. The baby was small and red-faced and serious, as babies are, with dark hair that was already Cecil's and a general expression of concentrated displeasure at the novelty of the world. "He looks angry," Cecil said. "He has just been born," Ada said. "I think that warrants some displeasure." Cecil reached out and touched the baby's hand, and the baby's fingers, with the reflex of newborns, closed around his finger. And something happened to Cecil's face that Ada knew she would carry in her memory as long as she had one. "Hello," Cecil said very quietly to the baby. "His name," Ada said. "We discussed several options." "We did," Cecil said. "I have a preference," Ada said. "Robert for his father, Robert Calloway." Cecil looked at her. "Are you certain?" "Robert Dalton built this valley," Ada said. "He deserves to be in the name of the boy who grows up in it." Cecil looked down at the baby. "Robert Calloway," he said, trying it out. "Robert Cecil Calloway," Ada said, "if you do not object." He did not object. He held his wife's hand and looked at his son, and outside the window the valley was doing its daily extraordinary thing with the morning light, and everything that had ever been taken from either of them. The years and the losses and the wrong roads and the hard winters, all of it had led to this room and this morning and this particular arrangement of people. And it seemed to Cecil Calloway, who was not a sentimental man but was an honest one, that the account was not merely balanced, but was overwhelmingly in his favor. He had ridden into this valley to collect what was owed, and he had left Owing something he could never fully repay. Not the debt to Ada's resilience or her directness or her kitchen garden or her laugh, but the debt of what she had done to him, which was to make him understand himself clearly and choose himself differently. No currency existed for that. No territorial court could adjudicate it. It was simply and completely his to carry, and he found that he was entirely glad to carry it. In the years that followed, Sweetwater Valley became something the territory talked about, not for drama or incident but for itself, for what it was and what it produced. The ranch grew steadily under both their hands, the herd expanding to 90 head by 1883, the kitchen garden becoming almost comically ambitious, Ada having learned by that point exactly what the soil and water table would support and pushing the boundaries of it with the same direct stubbornness she brought to everything. Tomas supervised the operation with the authority of a man who had been the senior presence on the land for years, and whose knowledge of its particulars was encyclopedic. Eli Cross proved out as a capable hand, and in 1882 married a woman from the Red Rock Crossing settlement named Clara, and they built a small house on the eastern edge of the property, and became part of the valley's household in a way that expanded the daily life of the place. Cecil's work with Hartwell continued at intervals through those years, more cases identified and documented, the territorial legal landscape shifting gradually toward greater protection for small ranching operations as Hartwell's body of case law accumulated. In 1884, the territorial legislature passed what the newspapers called the Smallholder Protection Act, a piece of statute that incorporated much of what Hartwell had argued in court across half a dozen cases, including the original Borden judgment. Cecil did not claim credit for this publicly and would not have wanted to. He simply noted it in a letter to Hartwell, and Hartwell wrote back that there were 8 ranch families across the territory whose continued ownership of their land was directly traceable to what had been assembled from the Dalton case and the subsequent work, and that he thought that was a sufficient accounting. Ada read that letter at the kitchen table on a February morning in 1884 with Robert, who was 3 and occupied with a carved wooden horse that Tomas had made him, sitting on the floor beside her. She read it and passed it across to Cecil and watched him read it and watched his face do the thing where the depth of his feeling showed briefly before he composed it back down. "Hartwell says 8 families," she said. "Yes." Cecil said. You came here for one, Ada said. He looked at her. I came here for money, he said. I stayed for considerably better reasons. She folded the letter and held it for a moment and then put it in the box on the shelf where she kept the important papers. The deed, the court ruling, the marriage certificate, the letters from Hartwell over the years. The letter she had written to the cattle broker in Tucson on the morning she rode to Reed Rock Crossing with Cecil for the first time. She kept those things because the record mattered. Because the facts of a life, arranged carefully, told you where you had come from and made the present comprehensible. Robert climbed into her lap with the wooden horse, and she wrapped her arms around him and looked at Cecil over the top of their son's dark head. And the valley outside the window was exactly what it had always been, red and gold and green, extraordinary present. In the spring of 1885, their daughter was born. They named her Marie, after no one in particular but the name that suited her, and she arrived in the world with Ada's dark eyes and Cecil's stillness, and a disposition that was sunny in a way that neither of her parents were, exactly, but that seemed to come from the combination of them, some third thing produced by their particular compound. Robert was 4.5 and received his sister with the grave attentiveness of a child who has been told something important is happening and is determined to approach it with appropriate seriousness. He sat beside Ada's bed and looked at the baby with his chin in his hands and said, "She is very small," and Ada said, "You were smaller," and he found this information so astonishing that he made her repeat it twice. Cecil held Marie on the porch in the early evening of her first day in the world, walking the slow back and forth that parents walk without knowing they are walking it, and Ada stood in the kitchen doorway watching him, and thought about everything that had led to this moment with the narrative comprehension you only get when enough time has passed to see the shape. He had ridden into her valley to collect what was owed. She had stood on the porch with a rifle and the conviction that she was going to protect what was hers, because it was hers and she had built it, and the world did not have the right to dismantle it simply because the world contained people like Borden and Fitch who understood how to make legal instruments into weapons. And he had sat down at her table and made a choice. Not the dramatic choice of a man performing heroism, but the quiet, accumulative choice of a man who looked at what he was doing with clear eyes and decided to do something better with the same available resources. She had not rescued him. He had not rescued her. They had together found the angle at which the problem could be solved, and the solving of it had made them different people than they had been separately, which was what the best partnerships did. The valley in the evening light was doing the thing it always did, which was to be completely, inexhaustibly itself, and the sound of the creek ran underneath everything the way it always had, and Robert was chasing Tomas's dog around the yard with the single-minded energy of a 4-year-old, and Eli and Clara were visible across the north pasture walking home in the evening, and Cecil was on the porch with their daughter, walking that slow walk, and Ada Calloway, who had once been Ada Dalton, who had stood on this porch with a rifle and a debt, and a loneliness as big as the canyon walls, stood in her doorway and felt the specific and complete satisfaction of a woman who knows exactly what she has and knows that she has kept it. She went out to the porch and Cecil turned and saw her and shifted Marie slightly in his arms to make space, and she came alongside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned in, and they stood together watching the valley go from gold to rose to the deep blue of a desert evening, the stars beginning to show above the eastern rim where the sandstone formations dropped away into the darkening sky. "What are you thinking?" Cecil asked. He asked her this still, after 6 years, with the same genuine curiosity he had brought to every conversation from the first morning coffee. "I am thinking about the arithmetic of it," Ada said. "You came here with a debt of $1,263 and some cents. I had nothing to pay it with, and now look at the size of what we have." He looked at her, and the evening light was in his eyes, and they were the color they always were, that gray-green like creek water in the shade that she had catalogued on the first day and had been returning to ever since. "I have thought about that debt often," he said. About what I owe you. You owe me nothing, Ada said. I owe you everything, he said quietly. You are the reason I became the version of myself that I can live with. There is no way to calculate that and no way to repay it. She looked up at him. Cecil, she said, you sat at my table and wrote a letter. You told the truth about what was happening and you did something about it. I did not give you that. You had that in you. You showed it to me, he said. Then we are even, Ada said, because you showed me things too. He pressed his lips to her hair, and she leaned into him, and Marie made the small sleeping sounds of a baby who has arrived in a world that is, on the whole, warm and held and sufficient. And Robert came tearing across the yard with the dog at his heels and Tomas following behind with the expression of a man who is nominally in charge of this situation and is aware that the nominally is doing significant work there. The evening settled into full dark and the stars came out over Sweetwater Valley in their thousands, the way they did out here where there was no other light to compete, thick and present and beautiful. And the creek ran over its stones with its ancient sound, and the valley was itself, entirely and completely, as it had been before any of them arrived and would be long after, but holding them in the meanwhile, holding them well. Ada and Cecil stayed on the porch a long time after Robert was put to bed, and Marie was settled in her crib, and Tomas had gone to his own quarters with the dog, and the evening had become fully night. They sat on the porch swing that Cecil had built and hung the previous fall, and Ada had her legs across his lap, and he had one hand resting on her ankle in the easy intimacy of people who have been touching each other with familiarity, and still with attention for years. And they talked about the spring drive and the garden expansion, and whether they ought to put in a second well on the north pasture, and they talked about Robert starting his letters with Clara in the evenings. And they talked about a letter from Ada's cousin in Missouri who was thinking of coming west, and whether the spare room would want any work before that visit. All of it ordinary. All of it the substance of a life that was theirs and was whole. Eventually the talking quieted, and they sat in the comfortable silence they had been building since the first morning coffee in October of 1878, a silence that was not absence but presence, that was full of everything they were to each other, and everything they had made together, and everything they intended still to make. The creek ran. The stars moved in their slow wheel above the canyon walls. The valley breathed around them, easy and deep, keeping its own counsel as it always had. Ada thought of the morning she had read Fitch's original notice and understood that everything she had built was in danger of being taken from her, and how that fear had lived in her chest for months like a stone she could not put down. The stone was gone now, had been gone for years, and in its place was something much better for carrying, something that did not diminish with use but grew more substantial, more entirely itself, with each year that passed. She turned her head and looked at Cecil in the dark, and he was looking at the stars with the quiet attention he gave to beautiful things, the same attention he had given to the wild horses in the Gila Valley, to the valley itself on the morning he first saw it, to their children asleep, to her, consistently and without reservation, for as long as she had known him. He felt her looking and turned his head and met her eyes, and in the dark his face was shadow and starlight and entirely familiar. "Still glad you stayed?" she asked. She asked it lightly, but he knew her well enough to hear the real question in it, which was not about staying but about all of it, the whole accumulated weight of the choice he had made. He reached up and took her hand. "Ada," he said, "I rode into this valley a man who was doing a job he had stopped believing in, who had not been still enough and long enough to know what he actually wanted, who had been moving through the world with papers and procedure in place of any genuine account of himself." He looked at her steadily. "And you stood on your porch with your husband's rifle and your clear eyes, and you offered me coffee, and everything that has happened since has been the best thing I have known." She held his gaze. "You came to collect a debt," she said. "I did," he said, "and instead I found the one thing I could never repay." She squeezed his hand and looked back at the stars, and the valley spread around them in the dark was its own kind of answer to every question, full and present and sufficient, the creek running its ancient note beneath the enormous sky. And Sweetwater Valley held them as it held everything, the way good land holds what is trusted to it, carefully, and for a very long time.